therapy, when you say therapy, it sort of comes in all shapes and sizes and forms, I guess. I find cooking therapeutic. I have very close friends who find cooking a chore and stressful and don't enjoy it at all. But they do other things like cleaning that they say makes them feel calm and centered. I'm also not that person. So we're all a little bit different, which makes the world a pretty fabulous place in some respects. And there's obviously the intention formalized therapy, which can also come in many forms from, sitting down and chatting to a therapist of sorts, also doing other sorts of therapy. There's also preventative things we do, isn't there? We know in our minds that our week will be better and we'll probably cope better with what we go through if we do things like go for a walk or go for a run. That's not me, but I imagine some people feel that way, the running bit. Reading, music, or seeing friends, people I know through school. They say that one of the most important things they can do is sit down and have a coffee with a friend and have that regular sort of contact. That's a therapy of sorts. And so if we can all agree at least that we all need some sort of therapy in inverted commas or something to help us through some of the trials and tribulations of life, then if you look to people who make up our prison population, it's no different really. They still need something in a sense, maybe to help them process. Being imprisoned doesn't necessarily mean they no longer have passion or desire to create if they were creative before. Or it might mean that being in that situation might drive them to create, to write poetry, to paint. There is a paper, or a magazine, I should say, that's called Paper Chained, and that showcases the work of people who are incarcerated, both when they're incarcerated, but also on the other side. Sometimes those people have gone on to have successful careers in art or in other things. Now, I spoke to the editor of that magazine, Paper Chain, Damien Linnane, I should say, just before we came on air. And he described a little bit about where the magazine came from and the idea behind it.
So it all goes back to when I was in custody myself. I got a 10-month non-parole period in New South Wales at the end of 2015. And I had this idea in my head that I would use the time constructively. I was hoping to go back to university or get therapy while I was in prison. And turns out neither of those options were available. There's very extremely limited education and no therapy available at all. And so I started panicking, and in order to do something constructive with my time, I ended up deciding to write a novel in prison and then teach myself to draw. But that was all well and good, except there was no place I could share my writing or artwork to. Everything I was creating was just ending up in a box under my bed. So I asked around, and nobody had even heard of a prison magazine. So I resolved to get involved in starting one up when I got out. This is a good thing. Somebody beat me to it by a couple of months. So I got on board with her, and I said, "Can I help you out with this? Because this is exactly what I wanted to do." And so for the next 4 or 5 years, she was producing that annually, and I was peripherally assisting with her. And then in 2021, she said, I can't do this anymore. You're the only person who's been with me the whole time. Do you want to take it over? And I did, even though I knew that I didn't have the time for that, because I knew how much mental health support that would give to people inside. And then the magazine kept getting bigger and bigger to the point where I couldn't volunteer on it anymore because it was too time consuming. And then I ended up applying for some funding for it. And long story short, I got it. So now I'm actually employed to make the magazine part-time. I've created a job for myself. Yeah.
And if I was to open up the magazine, what would I find?
Right, so everyone can read it. It's we go out to people in prison, but it's also available online as well. And so you'll find a lot of poetry, also other forms of writing as well, personal narratives, occasionally fiction, like short stories. But yeah, poetry's a big one. Also artworks people have created inside. And also since I've become employed to make the magazine, now I have more, time to work on it. And so now we also create content that we think prisoners will enjoy, mostly interviews with people who have gotten out of the prison system and, made something of themselves. We think those stories really give a lot of hope and inspire others.
The art, I mean, it's a beautifully presented magazine. I mean, it's quite edgy too. So the artworks that feature on the front of the covers, are they all produced by people in our prisons?
Yes, there was the one exception with the issue 9. I couldn't find any art at the time. It's actually kind of interesting. I get a lot of great art from people in prison, but people are very limited with what they can send me. It's what they can fit in an envelope. Occasionally we get really great photos. It's very difficult to take photos in prison, but you can apply for permission. And occasionally we get those kind of photos, but often they're like, the angle's bad, the lighting's terrible, and I don't have anything that's like quite nice enough to fit on a cover. So I had to work around for issue 9, but every other since I took over from 5 to 10, all the others are the artworks from people currently incarcerated. Yeah.
Some of them are incredible. Were these people who were artists before, or they just found this as an outlet when they were there?
Yeah, it seems to be a mix. A couple of people were quite arty beforehand. Myself, I was not. I started teaching myself art out of boredom, and ended up, we'll put it this way, I got a contract from Penguin Random House in 2021 to illustrate one of their books, and I actually used those illustrations for the cover of issue 8 because I didn't get anything else big enough to use as cover art for that issue. But it seems to be kind of split down the middle. Some people were even like semi-professional before they went in, but a lot of people discover that creativity in there. Possibly out of just desperation because there isn't much else constructive you can do with your time. Yeah.
You mentioned before that it was important for you to have an outlet. Can you explain a little bit more about what that's like when you're in a prison and the arts is something that assists?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think like anyone can really understand what being in prison is like unless they've experienced it themselves. The closest I can probably get you is, think of lockdown, but instead of when we were in COVID lockdown, you're an entire house, you still had a phone, you still had the internet. Imagine being in in a room the size of your laundry, completely cut off of the world. No phone, no internet, and also extremely limited things to work with. So I mean, any kind of creative outlet can make the world of difference in prison, and also just to pass the time as well. I was locked in, at some points for 16 hours a day, or sometimes a lot longer than that if we were on lockdown. Yeah, just like a lot of people just are sitting in there staring at the wall, and just anything constructive to do really makes a huge difference to your time, but also being able to produce something that you can be proud of that's something completely different. I get letters from people in prison all the time saying how much it's changed their life to finally see something they've created printed in a magazine now. Yeah.
Damien Linnane is editor of Paper Chain. He's our guest. Is it about getting them through that time, or at least giving them that while they're there, or is it also about showing them that they might be capable of other things when they do, in fact, when many of them will be released?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely a bit of both. I mean, there is a lot of people in prison, probably not surprisingly, they feel like they don't have a voice, and there's so much you want to express and you can't because nobody in there will listen. There's actually laws against journalists doing interviews with prisoners as well. So we can publish what they write themselves, but I can't actually do interviews with them, which is a bit interesting. But there's also definitely that element that we want to show people that that they might be capable of something else. It's quite interesting. I've worked prolifically with a group that does graphic design in prisons, and they said some of the feedback they got was people were like, oh wow, this is great, I didn't know I could make money out of art. My whole life I've been spray painting trains for free. And now they've found out that they can use that artistic talent for something actually constructive, and it's something that could possibly earn money with as well. Yeah.
As well as doing doing Paper Chain, you're also doing your PhD as well. Is this also inspired by your experience of when you were in prison?
Yes. So basically, yeah, I went in and I had a mandatory appointment with a prison psychologist when I went in, and there's a lot of psychologists in prison, but that they're all employed by corrections to write reports for corrections. None of them provide any therapy, and so I told the psychologist that I thought I really needed therapy to help address the cause of the crime I committed. And she said to me, Damien, everyone in here would benefit from therapy, but we're not given any funding for that. My job's just to write assessments. So that was when I turned to art and writing as a way of providing my own rehabilitation, since the prison wasn't going to give me any. And since I've gotten out, I'm now doing a PhD focus on trying to make mental health treatment available in prison and exploring mental health needs. And one of the ways I'm doing that is making the argument for Medicare to be available in prisons, because prisoners are the only Australian citizens that don't have access to Medicare. You lose your access as soon as you go in. And because you lose your Medicare access, you lose everything that can be provided through that. Everything from PBS to telehealth, and also the mental health care plan. So I was on a mental health care plan before I went in. I was getting therapy, and then as soon as I went in, that therapy stopped because I lost my Medicare access.
Do you think people's experience and sometimes recidivism that happens, do you think some of that could be averted, or if perhaps people received mental health support while they were in prison?
Oh, absolutely. Like, we've got an incredibly high recidivism rate in Australia. It's always going to be a percentage that it will reoffend no matter what. But I think like the majority of that is because, there's very limited therapy. There's extremely limited rehabilitation, education, and also the rehabilitation that does exist. There are these, ridiculous, 10, 20-hour courses that everybody passes by turning up. And the only reason the courses exist is because the prison's being given KPIs by the government, like, you need to rehabilitate X amount of people. Like, how are we going to do this? Oh, well, we'll create a course that everybody passes just by turning up. And they've actually done studies on these courses, and they've been proven to not reduce offending at all. So, like, even the courses we have, they're not aimed at rehabilitating people. They're aimed at helping the prison hit the ridiculous KPIs the government, is insisting from them. The prisons are underfunded as well. It's not entirely their fault.
So you've written a book, I understand too. You're editing the magazine and you're doing your PhD. It's a lot. When do you hope to have your PhD done by?
Right, so I just passed my confirmation, which is like the make or break point of a PhD. That was in April. That's the 1 year point. So the average one takes about 3 years. So I think I've got about 2 years to go. But I mean, PhDs can be delayed for things outside your control, like ethics approval and stuff. So I'm not entirely sure, but I'm thinking it'll take me at least another 2 years or so. But I definitely keep very busy between all the things I'm doing. Yeah.
Best of luck with everything, and thanks so much for taking the time today.
No, you're very welcome. It's been great to be on the program.
That was Damien Linnane there. He's the editor of Paper Chained. You can have a look online and have a look at the publication. Pretty incredible. Sometimes quite confronting artwork on the cover of it. It's a non-for-profit publication. You mentioned there he got a grant, which sort of pays him a wage to edit it. And it also gets posted free to people who are incarcerated wherever they are in the world. So it gets posted worldwide, and that's part of it. Sometimes they've requested copies, or they've been referred by friends, and then they're sent to them where they are in the prison.